Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The Death of Antony and Cleopatra by Historia Civilis. So this is the continuation of the series that Historia Civilis began so long ago with good old Julius Caesar, and now continues by following the life of Octavian as he rises to power and then becomes the sole ruler of Rome. This is a very big point in that journey, and I'm very excited to get into it. Now, if you guys need a refresher, the last video in this series was the Battle of Actium, where we saw Octavian and Agrippa defeating Antony and Cleopatra in Greece. Antony and Cleopatra then fled to Egypt. Octavian is now advancing towards Egypt, and it seems like we might be heading towards a final showdown. I guess we'll see what happens in this video. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
The final stage of the civil war between Octavian and Antony kicked off in the spring of 30 BCE.
It is finally coming to an end. We've been dealing with chaos, political infighting, and civil war for years and years since Caesar took up arms against Pompey, or maybe Pompey took up arms against Caesar. It depends really on how you frame it. It's finally coming to an end.
Octavian landed in Syria. Octavian was using Agrippa's plan for the campaign, which was to attack Egypt from two directions, one from Syria and the other from Libya, each army being shadowed by a fleet as it marched up the coast.
And as we've seen, it really is best to leave military affairs in the very capable hands of Marcus Agrippa. He knows what he's doing. In fact, he knows what he's doing probably better than any other Roman general of this period. He really is a master when it comes to this sort of strategy, and Octavian really is not. So, best to rely on Agrippa.
Two armies, two fleets, attacking from both land and sea from two directions, many independent moving pieces with no single point of failure. Classic Agrippa.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the plan we saw executed in the last video with the Battle of Actium. Sure, everything came to a head in this one single battle, but Agrippa had managed to put Antony and Cleopatra in that position by really setting them up for failure. This is how Agrippa's plans work. Very complicated. You know, your enemies have a couple of options to take. There are a lot of moving parts, but none of those options are really good. You squeeze them from all directions, basically.
Back in Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra had come to the realization that after losing tens of thousands of soldiers to desertion, they were no longer capable of defeating Octavian on land. They tried sending peace offers to Octavian. Octavian never responded. They tried sending him a massive bribe. He kept the bribe.
Oh, man. That's an Octavian move, I'll tell you that much. We can see how far Antony and Cleopatra have fallen. I mean, they've sort of given up the fight that they were once waging. Now, they're still trying to maintain some of their power, to maintain their independence from Octavian, but now they've been reduced to negotiating and attempting to bribe Octavian due to, first off, the loss at Actium, but, and we discussed this last time, even worse than the loss at Actium was that massive number of troops who had deserted Antony afterwards. They felt like it was sort of hopeless. He had fled the field. Why should they stick with him? Now Octavian just holds this massive advantage. Maybe Antony and Cleopatra aren't entirely done yet, but they're in a real tricky situation.
Cleopatra then had an idea. She figured out how to turn her useless Mediterranean fleet into a Red Sea fleet. With enough manpower and enough engineering, she believed that she could drag her ships over land, Fitzcarraldo style. Once they had a fleet in the Red Sea, they could credibly threaten to cut off Egypt's trade with the East.
All right.
She believed that Octavian would rather negotiate with them than deal with a headache like that.
Cleopatra's got a plan. She's trying to at least gain some sort of advantage back, gain some sort of leverage over Octavian, because right now, he holds all the leverage.
If he didn't want to negotiate, she and perhaps even Antony could escape to the east. Incredibly, she had her eyes set on northwest India, where a number of ethnically Greek kings would have been sympathetic to her cause.
This is very true. I mean, remember, the Egypt of this time is Ptolemaic Egypt. It is a Hellenistic, aka Greek kingdom, left over from Alexander's conquests. And if we remember Alexander's conquests, he had gone wide and far. There had already been Greek colonization of a lot of this region, but with Alexander, that Greek culture had spread even further. So, if you're looking for ethnically Greek allies who may be sympathetic to your cause, you can look pretty wide and far and find them.
Talk about some out-of-the-box thinking. I like this plan. Not even Agrippa had imagined Egypt pulling a stunt like this.
I mean, look, it's certainly some ingenuity from Cleopatra, and I respect that. I feel like it is worth pointing out at this point that Cleopatra has kind of seized the initiative from Antony, who I think took the defeat much harder than she did. You can sort of understand why. Cleopatra, she still holds her kingdom of Egypt, as she always did. Well, actually, once upon a time, she did not hold that kingdom, but she's basically in the same position, though that position is threatened very badly. Antony has lost a lot of what he once had. His conquests, his eastern conquests, the donations of Alexandria, a lot of that is gone. Octavian has overturned it. I think Antony is in sort of a bad place right now, so Cleopatra, she's sort of the one making the plans, deciding what to do, and then potentially dragging Antony along with her if he's willing to go.
Cleopatra put her plan into action. She gathered the necessary manpower and began dragging the first group of ships over land. But when they were about halfway to their destination, they were ambushed by Arab camel riders from the city of Petra.
Damn.
The ambush was successful. The camel riders killed the laborers and burned the ships.
Yeah, that's a big loss. I mean, that was your whole plan, and you have been intercepted. Oh no.
Ask why this happened. The Arab kingdoms in the region were not happy with Antony's reorganization of the Roman East, and this was their way of getting revenge. An unintended consequence of Antony's reforms.
Yep.
After learning of this defeat, Antony urged Cleopatra to give up on her extremely good idea. A mistake, in my opinion. Antony still had hope that his 50,000 soldiers from Greece were wandering around the Roman East somewhere. We know that they surrendered to Octavian last year, and if Antony was clear-headed about it, he would have known it too. But
Yeah. This is exactly what I was saying, if Antony was clear-headed about it. But he's clearly not. He's taken the defeat hard. This is not a logical belief to have, but Antony's still holding on to it. I'm gonna get my men back, they'll come back, and we can live to fight another day. Okay. Well, I guess we'll see if that works, Antony.
But he was holding on to a deluded belief that they would
Yeah.
appear just in the nick of time. Shortly after this, King Herod of Judea betrayed Antony and went over to Octavian's side. He rolled out the red carpet and spared no expense supplying Octavian's legions as they...
Oh yeah, well look, this is what happens when you're dealing with this sort of geopolitical situation, right? We're looking at the Roman East. Now, some of this territory Rome controls directly, some of the territory is controlled by client states such as Egypt, and then you also have maybe a looser organization of allies, and maybe states that aren't even allied, but you're still in contact with. So, if you're someone like King Herod of Judea, what you want to do is you want to side with the winners. And so if you look around and you say, you know what, Antony's having a real bad time, and Octavian, he's got the momentum, it looks like he is going straight for victory, I'm going to switch my allegiance to Octavian, and I'm going to do all I can to impress and help him so I can keep some, or hopefully all, of my power after all of this is over.
They passed through his territory. When Antony heard this bit of information, reality really started to set in. According to Plutarch, none of this news upset Antony. It was as if he was pleased to put aside his hopes, since in doing so, he could also let go his worries.
Yeah, and I think at this point, not only, Mark Antony's been holding on to some of these frankly delusional beliefs and hopes that maybe he could still win, while Cleopatra, as I put it, tries to drag him along with her plan, but now he's basically sunk into hopelessness. Now it's, there's different ways to take that. One could fall completely into despair. One could fall into a sort of apathy, which it seems sort of like Antony is heading in that direction, but none of these are really good if you want to be the able commander of a successful army. If you want to still defeat Octavian.
The couple began throwing expensive dinner parties every night and would load their guests up with gold and treasure before sending them home. It was as if they knew the end was near.
Yeah, they're self-destructing. They know the end is near, they can see it, so they're like, all right, well, we've got nothing to lose. Lavish dinner parties, sending all the gold of the Egyptian treasury away. We won't need it anyway, and, they're acting self-destructively. That's only going to increase as time goes on.
Antony led his armies on a few excursions that were intended to slow the enemy down, with mixed results. Minor victories in the east, minor defeats in the west, nothing that would make much of a difference. By July 31st, Antony had returned to Alexandria.
It's like, look, Antony can win all the minor victories he wants, or lose all the minor defeats, but it's just not going to change the situation. We're zoomed in right now, but if you zoomed out, you would see a vast Roman Empire controlled by Octavian, and then the Kingdom of Egypt, controlled by Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And Agrippa and Octavian are not even slowly, but quickly closing in on Egypt. They're basically done, No minor scale battle or skirmish is going to change that.
And Octavian was at the gates. That evening, Antony was in a dark mood. He knew that there was only one thing left to try, but he was fairly certain that it would not work. He was finally looking at his predicament clearly. This was probably his last night on Earth.
Clarity. That clarity of mind that some experience right at the end. That's what Antony is experiencing.
He hosted a feast and told his Roman generals, "Drink deep, for tomorrow you may have a new master."
Yeah.
On the morning of August 1st, Antony led what remained of his army through the gates of Alexandria. Cleopatra sent what remained of her fleet out of the harbor in support. They both knew that Alexandria was in no position to withstand a siege against such a massive force. Their only hope was to go on the offensive and win an unexpected victory. Due to Agrippa's strategy, one victory would not be enough. They had to win on land and at sea.
That's exactly right, and that's why I say, look, one minor skirmish won't do it. Even one major victory isn't quite going to do it because of this plan that Agrippa has established. He's got you in a vice grip. You need to win on multiple fronts.
At the same time, of course, there was very little chance of this working. Agrippa had another army and another fleet on the way. Even a crushing victory would only buy them some time until they had to do the whole thing again.
Yeah.
But this was how Antony wanted to go down.
They're fighting the inevitable, but I suppose to Antony it's better to fight the inevitable than to succumb, or at least immediately to succumb. He would like to try and fight his way out of this, which I think, even in this time of despair and hopelessness, that fits Antony's character.
In a blaze of glory. Antony's army left the gates, and Cleopatra's fleet left the harbor. And then, to Antony's utter dismay, Cleopatra's ships immediately surrendered. The naval assault on Alexandria would go unchallenged. victory was now impossible. When Antony's cavalry saw this, they fled.
Yep.
Antony was left to face Octavian.
And so immediately Antony's navy, or Cleopatra's navy, but Antony's navy and Antony's cavalry surrender. He's left without them. So even the brief, minor hope that he maybe had has faded dramatically.
Octavian with only his infantry. He attacked and harassed Octavian's forces, but they easily held their ground. By the end of the day, most of his army had been lost, but improbably, Antony was still alive. He fled back through the gates of Alexandria in defeat. Despite his best efforts, Antony had failed to go out in a blaze of glory.
Yeah, like we said, it's in Antony's character to try and fight the inevitable, even while he despairs, but unfortunately he couldn't do it. And, at this point, you don't know exactly how the story is going to end, but you can see that Antony is done for. It's kind of a sad way for him to go out. He's really not going out in a blaze of glory, a man who fought so hard throughout the entirety of his life. Whether he was fighting alongside Caesar, fighting against Caesar's assassins, or trying to defeat Octavian, he was a fighter through and through. But he won't go out as a fighter, not really. Even though he tries, he really does.
Antony re-entered the royal palace and began causing a scene by screaming at random people as they scurried by.
Jeez.
How could this happen? Why would the ships surrender without putting up a fight? He must have been betrayed. Who else could it be? It had to be Cleopatra. She must have ordered her ships to surrender. Now we get into a real ambiguous section, because every surviving account of these next events are significantly different. What we know for sure is that, at this time, one of Cleopatra's servants approached Antony and informed him that the queen was dead.
Yeah, so there is a lot of ambiguity about the deaths of both Antony and Cleopatra. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding Roman history in general. We have a lack of sources. Many of those sources we have are conflicting on certain events, and Roman historians are known to exaggerate or just blatantly make things up. But even with all of that, this event is particularly ambiguous. But Historia Civilis is going to tell us what we know and what we can only speculate on.
The other thing that we know for sure is that this was not true. She had in fact taken refuge in her own mausoleum for her own safety.
Mm-hmm.
Some versions of this story would have you believe that this was simply a misunderstanding. That's way too cute. I don't buy it. It is my opinion that Cleopatra heard from her servants that Antony believed that she had betrayed him, and told a servant to go and tell him that she was dead in order to escape his wrath. But
yeah, so there's a lot of speculation on what exactly happened here. As Historia Civilis puts it, what we know is that Antony, losing this battle, being left by his cavalry and his navy, despairing, heads back into the city, and is informed that the queen has committed suicide, or at least that the queen is dead, upon which he takes his own life. Now, what exactly went down here? One option is that it was a misunderstanding. You can judge for yourself how likely each one of these options is. Seems a little convenient. Sometimes history is convenient. I don't know. There is the possibility that Cleopatra, waiting in her mausoleum, there's some speculation that she did intend to kill herself, perhaps in a blaze of glory, a literal blaze of fire, and go out with her treasure. So maybe that was it. Maybe she was going to kill herself, and that's what Antony had been told, or something along those lines. Or maybe she really was betraying him at the last moment. There's a lot of speculation that in these final months, final days, as you saw, Antony had really been pushed into despair after this final loss at Actium, whereas Cleopatra still had a plan. She still wanted to keep going, and she was willing to be a little more pragmatic than Antony was. And so some people think that, well, she was planning on fleeing anyway. Maybe she would flee with Caesarion, he is, according to many, the son of Julius Caesar. He could still be a threat to Octavian. But at this point, Antony's just dragging her down. So maybe she directly ordered her navy to betray him and basically set up his suicide in order to either flee or to negotiate with Octavian or some mixture of the two. Basically, make an out for herself. Once again, this is also fuzzy, also ambiguous, and there's also ambiguity surrounding her death, which will come a little bit later, so everything gets a little bit confusing, but, some stuff we know, there's a lot of stuff we can only speculate on, and you can sort of decide from what we have what you think might have went down, but let's hear Historia Civilis describe it.
But again, that is only my opinion. When Antony heard of Cleopatra's supposed death, Plutarch has him saying the following: "O Cleopatra, I am not distressed to have lost you, for I shall straightway join you. But I am grieved that a commander as great as I should be found to be inferior to a woman in courage." What a charming guy.
Yeah. Look, Antony was never known for his charm, his charisma. We've seen this throughout this wonderful series by Historia Civilis. Those were absolutely not his strong suits.
Antony drew his sword and handed it to his servant, who was apparently named Eros. Eros as in erotic? That can't have been his real name, right? Were Antony and Cleopatra giving their servants erotic little nicknames? That's nasty, man. Seems like an HR issue at the very least.
Well, yeah, but we're talking about the ancient Romans and especially the ancient Egyptians. First off, I've heard Eros more associated with maybe love or lust. I don't know how explicitly erotic the name was or how explicitly dirty. Maybe it was, but also, these people were doing some weird stuff. The upper classes, the aristocracy of Rome and Egypt, they were doing some weird things, so I wouldn't necessarily doubt it, to be frank.
Eros accepted Antony's sword. Antony ordered Eros to kill him. Eros did the funniest possible thing under the circumstances.
Oh?
He killed himself instead.
Oh, come on, bro! You don't like to laugh at someone's death, especially self-imposed, but that's exactly right. You had one job, man, and it was to kill Mark Antony, and instead you ultimately failed that job. You completely failed it by offing yourself instead. Oh, Antony, this is not an impressive way to go out.
Eros dropped to the ground, and Antony was in shock. He shouted at nearby servants for help, but they all fled. Antony decided that he had to do the deed himself. He picked up his sword, turned it around, and jammed it through his ribs. In true Roman fashion, he was aiming for his heart, but in true Antony fashion, he missed. He hit his stomach instead.
Yep.
Stomach wounds are not immediately fatal, but they are extremely painful. Servants scattered as Antony's anguished cries filled the royal palace.
Really a terrible way to go, so at this point he's almost certainly going to die, but he's now writhing on the ground in pain as he deals not with a quick stab to the heart, but slow death from a stomach wound. My goodness. And I will say, to be fair, Historia Civilis says this is the most Antony way to go. I don't know if Antony was that much of a bumbling fool. He could be coarse at times. He was maybe not the most intelligent participant in all of these negotiations and wars and the political chaos of the era. He could be bumbling at times, but, he was still fairly competent. He was a skilled commander, so I'd give him maybe a little more credit than that.
He begged passers-by to finish the job, but nobody dared touch him. Eventually, word got back to Cleopatra that Antony was mortally wounded on the floor of the palace. She probably felt sorry for him. Again, that's just my opinion. And ordered her servants to bring him to her in her mausoleum.
Now that's an interesting turn of events. So, I mean, it's a pretty terrible way to die, but he did get brought to Cleopatra because of it. The very much still alive Cleopatra.
A word about Cleopatra's mausoleum. The structure was 2 stories, which seems like an unnecessary feature for a tomb, but they did things a little differently back then. The top floor had been converted to a living quarters, in case Cleopatra needed a place to hide out while the Romans sacked the city. The bottom floor had been filled to the brim with treasure amassed from all across Egypt, alongside a dangerous amount of flammable material.
Yes.
From these facts alone, her calculations seem clear. She had plenty of cards to play and was perfectly willing to negotiate. She was also willing to destroy an unthinkable amount of wealth and herself.
Yeah.
And
well, at this point, she has sort of been left without a plan, and so she's had to make her own plan, which is, as I mentioned earlier, she is ready to literally go out in a blaze of glory, burn herself, and burn this impressive amount of treasure. She's trying to gain any possible leverage in this situation.
Then, of course, there was the most important feature of Cleopatra's mausoleum. Near the entrance, there was a clever contraption built into the wall. Once triggered, the contraption dropped a giant stone slab in front of the door. By the time Cleopatra learned of Antony's condition, that contraption had been triggered. Cleopatra was locked inside her own tomb. The only means of communication with the outside world was a small balcony on the 2nd level. In time, Antony was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, but the servants found that they had no way of bypassing the stone slab to get inside. Cleopatra ran out onto the 2nd floor balcony and began barking orders. The mausoleum was still being worked on, so
I knew that Antony was dragged to her mausoleum alive. I didn't know the doors had already been shuttered.
there was some construction equipment nearby. There was a rope and pulley system that was meant to haul stone up the side of the building. And Cleopatra instructed her servants to tie that end of the rope around Antony's waist.
God.
Cleopatra and
how humiliating does this death have to get?
Her 2 ladies-in-waiting grabbed the other end of the rope and, using all of their strength, lifted Antony into the air.
I mean, I guess at this point you'd rather be in the mausoleum than out, but this is, like I said, a really humiliating way to go for Antony, who would have very much rather, died on the battlefield. Oh, come on. He's just dangling there.
Plutarch describes the truly bizarre scene. Witnesses say that this was the most pitiful sight imaginable.
I'm sure.
Up he went, soaked in blood and in the throes of death, stretching his arms out towards her, even as he dangled in the air beside the wall of the tomb. The task was no easy one for a woman, clinging to the rope, as, with the strain showing on her face.
I will say, I think this really does symbolize, that final era of the relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about their relationship, how exactly it went, who had power over who. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, there's a lot of speculation about, the wily Eastern woman Cleopatra who had bewitched Mark Antony and all this sort of stuff. And I don't think it was necessarily like that. At times, they were certainly a partnership, and at times, Antony was absolutely leading the way, but as we saw in this video, that final era, final time in their relationship, really Antony was sort of lost to despair, and Cleopatra had to lead the way, which I think is very much symbolized by this, her dragging his half-dead body his body on the verge of passing up into her mausoleum, where she has a self-destructive plan ready in order to gain some sort of leverage, or at least go out spiting Octavian.
Cleopatra struggled to bring the line up, while on the ground below, people shared her agony and called on encouragement to her. It was a heroic effort. Cleopatra and her ladies-in-waiting used all of their muscles to get Antony up onto the balcony and then into the mausoleum. When Cleopatra saw the state that Antony was in, she literally rended her garments in grief. She scratched at her chest and smeared Antony's blood on her face and wailed uncontrollably.
Jesus.
This behavior was not unheard of in the ancient world, but it belonged at a funeral. Antony begged her to be calm. He told her that Octavian was the kind of man that could be reasoned with. He urged her to get whatever deal for herself that she could.
Yeah.
He then asked for a
That's what she's going for.
drink of wine, probably to help with the pain, and died.
At least he had a couple final words before he went, but really not the ends that Antony would have hoped for himself. It feels right at this moment to give a bit of a eulogy to Mark Antony. I think we've sort of already pointed out what is worth pointing out. Antony was not necessarily a sophisticated man, maybe not the most intelligent political operator of the time, but I think he could absolutely be competent, and he was a skilled military commander. More than anything else, he was a fighter, and we'd seen that throughout his life. Like I mentioned earlier, whether he was serving under Caesar, fighting against Caesar's conspirators, operating on his own, or fighting against Octavian, he really was a fighter. He put it all on the line many, many times. He won many battles. He had his failings, especially his failings as a negotiator, a politician, a political leader. He really was not good at those things, which sort of explains why this didn't necessarily work out for him. We look, of course, in the end, Octavian defeated Mark Antony militarily, mainly with the help of Marcus Agrippa. But if we look at basically every negotiation or political interaction between Octavian and Mark Antony, it's always Octavian rising up at the expense of Antony. Now, at times, Antony did have the upper hand over Octavian, but as we get closer and closer to this point, Octavian is only increasing his power base, and Antony seems to be slipping, or at the very least stagnating. So, the life of Mark Antony, an interesting one, a fascinating one. He rose higher than I think anyone could have ever imagined, and for that, you have to give him credit, but a pretty pitiful and humiliating end for a man like that.
There's a pretty strong case to be made that Cleopatra was way ahead of Antony, already thinking ahead to negotiations with Octavian.
And that's kind of what I believe as well. That's what I've been implying or saying throughout this episode. I think at this point in time, Cleopatra was very much ahead of Antony. She was more clear-headed. She had a plan for the future. She saw several options, whereas Antony either just wasn't clear-headed enough or just wasn't willing to do the same thing.
Why else physically separate herself from a defeated Antony by locking herself in her mausoleum? Why else gather all that treasure into one place, alongside the means to destroy it? She must have thought that a bargain was possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Somebody from Antony's camp stole his bloody sword from the floor of the palace, and personally delivered it to Octavian. We are told that Octavian wept when he received the sword. You can believe that if you want. I don't.
Okay. I will say, Historia Civilis does have a bit of a vendetta against Octavian. He really doesn't like him. But on this particular instance, I would say I also sort of doubt that. This is the sort of thing that you basically have to choose whether to believe or not. We really don't know what happened, but I imagine this is a bit of Octavian's propaganda meant to harken back to his adopted father, Julius Caesar, who, if we remember, had also wept and been very upset upon the death of Pompey. Now, I believe Caesar was being genuine. We've talked about this before. There were several reasons he could have been upset, some more self-serving than others, but I do believe he was genuinely upset. Octavian, on the other hand, I have a hard time believing he was genuinely sad at this turn of events. It sort of seemed like that's the direction we were heading in anyway. Octavian didn't really have that same magnanimous streak that Caesar did. Or he didn't have it to the same extent. Octavian was willing to be far more brutal, far more often. I'll put it that way. Both men could be brutal, and both men could be magnanimous and gracious at times, but I think Caesar usually leaned towards magnanimity, and Octavian often leaned towards maybe not brutality, but cold, calculating, that sort of attitude. So, maybe Octavian didn't have any sort of upset reaction. Maybe he did, and it was fake, he was putting it on, or maybe he genuinely was upset. We don't know. That's up for you to decide.
The next morning, Octavian entered Alexandria. He was accompanied by a local philosopher who had agreed to show him the sights. This was partially for his own benefit, I guess, but it was mostly a signal to the locals that he was not going to loot or destroy the city. Octavian had never been to Egypt before, and what he saw moved him deeply.
I'm sure.
Huge buildings made out of expensive stone.
I mean, we talked about this when good old Julius Caesar was operating in Egypt, but, Egypt was a very long-standing culture of its own. Alexandria was a very impressive city with a lot of history, a lot of culture, a lot of art, all that good stuff. I mean, it certainly had stood longer than Rome had, for example, so this would have been very impressive to Octavian, I'm sure.
Magnificent public works. Roads that were actually pleasant and functional. The kind of smart, walkable, mixed-use urbanism that's illegal to build in many American cities. Romans considered their city the center of the civilized world. But compared to Alexandria, Rome was a backwater.
This is true. That's a funny joke, by the way. And I feel what Historia Civilis may be implying here is that when Octavian visited Alexandria, he maybe got some ideas for what he could do in Rome. Because, for those that don't know, and I hope we see this in future Historia Civilis episodes about the reign of Augustus, but during his reign, Octavian, Augustus, as he's called as emperor, would initiate a whole series of infrastructure projects, building projects. He would build a lot of public monuments, infrastructure, buildings for public use. He would turn, or at least begin the process of turning Rome into a city that was really worth the title of, center of the Roman world, because Historia Civilis is exactly right. At this point, Rome is certainly an important city, and there were some impressive monuments, but it was still a bit of a backwater compared to somewhere like Alexandria. But Octavian will start the process of turning Rome into a very impressive city in its own right. Now, there's this common quote associated with Augustus, with Octavian, I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This is a little over-exaggerated. He did not wave a wand and change the whole city into this marble paradise, but he began that process. And during his reign and afterwards, Rome would become this very impressive center of trade, commerce, literature, art, culture, etc., etc., etc. Something maybe a little bit like Alexandria. So I think that might be what Historia Civilis is implying here.
Many have guessed that Octavian's positive experience in Alexandria influenced his own ambitions when it came to reshaping Rome later in life.
I think that's very possible. I do.
Octavian sent agents to negotiate with Cleopatra, but she would only speak to them through the stone slab. Cleopatra wanted a formal agreement with Octavian that upon her death, the kingdom of Egypt would go to her children. If he would not make that commitment, she threatened to burn the mausoleum to the ground, destroying her treasure and herself. This dialogue went back and forth for a while.
She's using any bit of leverage she can, and you know what? With Cleopatra, I believe her. I believe she would go through with it. So Octavian does have to be careful. She's on guard, basically. She knows the situation she's in, and she's going to at least try and negotiate intelligently. Now, to be fair, in the grand scheme, she's not in a fantastic position. She has developed this plan sort of at the last moment, grasping to anything she could, but she does still have a plan.
But no agreement was reached. The next day, negotiations continued. While Cleopatra was busy speaking through the stone slab, one Roman negotiator grabbed a ladder and sneakily climbed onto the second-floor balcony.
Yes, but you know, Octavian, come on, this is not a man to act in good faith. And that can be portrayed as a bad thing, or it can be portrayed as a good thing. Octavian was absolutely cunning. If he felt like, Cleopatra, she sort of got herself in a good position, and now she wants me to negotiate with her, I need to find another way in.
He descended the stairs and walked up behind Cleopatra and her ladies-in-waiting. He scared the crap out of them.
I can imagine.
Cleopatra jumped back and screamed, "Wretched Cleopatra, you are taken alive!" She drew a dagger and stabbed herself. The Roman negotiator physically overpowered her and got the dagger away from her. The wounds were found to be superficial.
Yep, she lived
Cleopatra
for now.
was now the prisoner of Octavian, and in
The last thing she wanted, the absolute last thing she wanted. Like I said, Mark Antony and Cleopatra near the end of their lives had been increasingly self-destructive. Mark Antony, of course, ended up killing himself, though we know the ambiguity surrounding that. I think Cleopatra, well, it's clear to me she was absolutely ready to burn herself alive along with her treasure, or maybe kill herself and then have her servants burn it. I don't know. She tried to take her own life right there, but she's been foiled. She's been captured alive.
In captivity, she fell ill. It's possible that one of her self-inflicted wounds got infected. Cleopatra and Octavian met face-to-face about a week later. There are two versions of this meeting that are quite different, but the most believable version...
And once again, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of ambiguity. So we're going to hear these different accounts.
...comes from Plutarch. He describes Cleopatra as being disheveled, dressed in rags, and visibly sick from the infection or whatever it was. She had also stopped eating. In this version, she throws herself at Octavian's feet and begs for the lives of her children. At the time, Cleopatra was literally the richest person in the world. Octavian asked her for a complete inventory of her personal wealth. Gold, treasure, everything. Nobody said it out loud, but a deal was taking shape. Cleopatra's vast personal wealth in exchange for the lives of her children. Cleopatra provided the inventory, but one of her servants came forward and completely threw her under the bus by telling Octavian that she had omitted her entire jewelry collection from the list. Surely...
Talk about loyalty! No one's loyal these days! What's going on?
This was Cleopatra's backup plan, as the jewelry alone would have made her a wealthy woman for the rest of her life. She saved face by offering the jewelry collection as a gift to the women in Octavian's family. Octavian accepted.
Smart. I mean, we talked about how Mark Antony was not the best at these sort of negotiations. Cleopatra, this was far more her thing. I mean, we've seen from her time rising to the throne, dealing with Caesar, then Mark Antony, then Octavian, she definitely was more talented at this style of negotiation.
Shortly after this meeting, word got back to Cleopatra that preparations were being made to send her to Rome. This meant that Octavian intended to have her walk in his triumph.
Yes.
Cleopatra's sister had walked in a Roman triumph, and for a queen of Egypt, there
Arsinoe.
could be no greater humiliation.
Absolutely. We remember Arsinoe though if I remember correctly, her life was spared in the end. I think a more relevant example to think back on might be someone like Vercingetorix, because that's someone we became familiar with throughout Historia Civilis' videos. This great warrior and leader who was kept in captivity for years, marched through the streets of Rome in a very humiliating fashion, and then killed. Now imagine that, but to the pharaoh of Egypt. That is a impressive position. Like we've stated, she heads an important, prosperous, and historically significant country. And she's going to be marched through the streets of Rome and humiliated. It's about the worst possible thing that could happen to her.
9 days after the death of Antony, Octavian and Cleopatra appear to have come to an understanding regarding Cleopatra's personal wealth and the fate of her children. Cleopatra arranged for a massive midday feast for her and her 2 servants. After the meal, she asked one of her Roman guards to deliver a note to Octavian. Sometime later, Octavian received the note. It simply read the following: "I wish to be entombed alongside Antony."
Yep.
Realizing the implications, Octavian rushed to Cleopatra's living quarters.
And there's also, a lot of supposed quotes about Cleopatra saying something like, "I will not be a part of your triumph," or something along those lines.
When he entered the room, the queen was reclined on a sofa, impeccably dressed, in full royal regalia, dead. One of her ladies-in-waiting lay dying on the ground, and the other was not far behind her, making some final adjustments to the queen's clothing.
Poisoned. Suicide.
Nobody knows exactly how Cleopatra died. Some say that she was
Here comes some of the ambiguity.
killed by a snake that was
Yes.
smuggled inside a basket of figs. Others say it was poison.
Now look, once again, we truly don't know what happened, and, anything, really. But, to me, the poison theory sounds a lot more feasible, in my opinion. Now, just because something is unlikely doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I think the snake theory sounds a lot less likely than it just being poison that killed her.
I don't find the snake story likely. And
Yeah.
frankly, I'm always surprised when serious historians take it at face value.
Yeah, I agree.
We know that Octavian's triumph would later have a painting that depicted Cleopatra being bitten by a snake. But since the snake was Egypt's national animal, this could be read as purely symbolic. All of the serious contemporary sources say that death by snakebite was a public rumor at the time.
Yeah.
Perhaps a rumor started when Octavian showed the public a painting of that very thing happening.
And this is how the history gets muddled. We've talked about how some of our Roman historians didn't necessarily do the best job fact-checking, but we also have the issue of propaganda to contend with. And Octavian in particular, well, he was a prolific propagandist, and he paid a lot of people, a lot of historians, to write a lot of propaganda, and he disseminated a lot of propaganda throughout his reign. So things really can get quite muddled, but I very much agree with this. The poison theory seems far more realistic, though at the end of the day, it's more of an aesthetic difference. Did she die by poison? Did she die by snake? Doesn't really matter that much. Now, she probably didn't die by snake, but I think it just adds a little flourish to the story that probably very much most likely didn't happen.
But nobody really takes it seriously as a definitive explanation for her death until like 200 years after the fact. Notably, the Romans tore the room apart after Cleopatra died, and nobody ever found a snake. That seems like an important detail to me.
Yeah.
One of the strongest bits of
They would have found that snake. Come on now. If she'd been killed by a snake smuggled in, you can bet they would have found that snake.
evidence against the snakebite is that Plutarch mentions offhandedly that Cleopatra had become obsessed with finding the most painless way to die, and had spent some time researching various kinds of poisons. The Egyptians knew a lot about poison, and they were very much aware that, unlike poison, snake bites were not painless, and they were not predictable. One ancient source goes further and says that Cleopatra was rumored to wear a hollow pin in her hair that she filled with a deadly poison. That same source notes that Cleopatra's body was found with marks on her arms, which very well may have been where she stuck herself with the pin. In my eyes, this is the most likely explanation. Cleopatra died on August 10th of 30 BCE.
Yeah, could have been a poisonous pin, could have been some other way of ingesting that poison. Once again, we don't really know. But the poison seems far more realistic, and it seems to me that given the situation she was in, Cleopatra absolutely would have made sure there was some way to painlessly, or as painlessly as possible, commit suicide. And so a hairpin seems as realistic as really any other method she could have used.
She was 39 years old.
And that is the end of Cleopatra. Alright, so we talked about Mark Antony. After he died, it feels only fair to talk about Cleopatra. Now, she's someone who, of course, an Egyptian ruler, but she became very closely involved in Roman affairs. From the time of Julius Caesar, she formed a political alliance, and of course a relationship with him that led to Caesarion, though there's always been debate over was Caesarion truly the biological son of Julius Caesar. Some will say yes, and some will say no. A lot of people believed it, I'll tell you that much, to her alliance and relationship with Antony. You know, there's been a lot of speculation about Cleopatra's character. You know, I'm doing reactions to HBO's Rome series, this very popular Roman drama, and they go with a depiction of Cleopatra that has been fairly typical throughout history, portraying her as this sort of seductress, this, sort of luxurious, oriental Eastern woman who managed to seduce the likes of Caesar and Mark Antony and bring them into her sinful Eastern ways. You know, I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, but there is often a negative connotation with the name Cleopatra. And what I think is that that's probably unfair, and that honestly, it's not entirely clear what exactly she was like. I think the things we do know is that she was cunning, she was intelligent, she was someone who was willing to do what she needed to do to achieve her goals. And her goals were to bolster her position and to strengthen her kingdom. And if we look at what she did, she was always trying to achieve those goals. You know, we see the Battle of Actium, and a lot of people are upset at Cleopatra for fleeing. Now, we don't know if she'd agreed with Antony beforehand, or if that was spontaneous, or what. But, as I said last time, she was looking out for herself and her kingdom, and I really don't think you can blame her for that. So, Cleopatra, a much sort of debated about historical figure, a lot of speculation about her character. I think, of course, we can't know what she was truly like. It's too contentious. You know, we just don't know. There has been a lot of misinformation about her. Of course, there's been a lot of propaganda about her during the time she was alive, immediately after her death, and since that point. But, like I said, I do think she was intelligent, cunning, and always worked towards those goals. I think those are things that we do know about her.
Immediately after Cleopatra's death, her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion, now 17 years old, was caught trying to flee the country.
Yep.
As the illegitimate son of Julius Caesar, Caesarion was a direct rival to Octavian, or at least that's what Octavian believed. He ordered him put to death.
That is what Octavian believed, and I think he was right. I mean, like I said, there's been some speculation about whether Caesarion was truly the son of Julius Caesar or not. I think he probably was. And frankly, I think he was a threat to Octavian's power. I mean, Octavian, though he was related to Caesar, Caesar was only his adoptive father. Caesarion, that was the real biological son of Julius Caesar. As long as he survived, he presented a threat to Octavian. And like I said earlier, you know, there's some speculation that during those final days when Antony was sort of sinking deeper into despair, that Cleopatra wanted to sort of leave him behind and flee with Caesarion. He was many things, a bargaining chip, a threat to Octavian, potential for a future. So, I think it's brutal. But I think this is something fairly typical throughout history when you have basically a rival to the throne, especially someone who has some sort of bloodline connection to that throne. And I guess in this case, by the throne, we're talking about Caesar, a connection to Caesar. Then you usually got to take him out in one way or another.
But aside from Caesarion, whatever deal had been worked up between Octavian and Cleopatra, Octavian appears to have honored it. He rounded up Cleopatra's 3 other children and had them shipped to Rome to be raised by his sister Octavia. That meant that Octavia was raising 1 child from Antony's previous marriage, 2 children from her marriage to Antony, and 3 children from Antony and Cleopatra.
Goodness. What an interesting family dynamic. I mean, Octavian's got his sister raising, not enemies of his, but people who are the children of enemies of his. It's sort of odd. Though, of course, the 2 Antonias, those are the natural-born daughters of Octavia. So, they have that blood connection, of course.
Octavia never remarried, and I don't blame her. Sounds like she had her hands full.
Yeah.
Cleopatra's children were raised with honor and dignity, which is honestly surprising. When they were of age, the daughter was married to King Juba of Mauritania, which is a fitting match for the child of the last queen of Egypt.
Yeah.
It seems that after the marriage, all 3 remaining children moved to North Africa, where they lived out the rest of their lives in prosperity. Octavian formally annexed Egypt on August 31st of 30 BCE.
There you go.
We all know that the month of July got its name from Julius Caesar, in honor of his birthday. August got its name from Octavian, and there's a common misconception that this was also in honor of his birthday, but that's not true. August was named in honor of Octavian's conquest of Egypt.
Yep, I didn't know that. Of course the month is named after Octavian. I didn't know it was specifically in relation to his conquest of Egypt, but hey, that's a pretty big deal. I feel like I've emphasized a lot sort of the importance, the history, the prosperity of Egypt, so to conquer it, that's damn impressive. Think about it. This was Ptolemaic Egypt. A holdover from the time of Alexander, a holdover from the Hellenistic era, and now it's gone. Now it has been integrated into the Roman Empire. This is a trend that's been happening for a while now, but if you want to look at the shift from sort of that Hellenistic era, these kingdoms that were left after Alexander the Great's conquests, the shift towards the era of Roman domination, this is a important point in that shift, and a point pretty near the end. We're really coming upon an era of Roman domination. We're heading towards the Pax Romana, this era of Roman peace, domination, and prosperity. And so to conquer Egypt, that is a big deal.
That's how big of a deal it was.
Yeah.
For the better part of 19 years, ever since Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome had been at war with itself.
Wow.
And now, with the defeat of Mark Antony and the conquest of Egypt, Rome was at peace.
Finally.
It was the end of an era, or perhaps it's better to say that it was the beginning of a new one.
'Twas.
The victory transformed the 33-year-old Octavian not only into the richest man on earth, but much more importantly, into the unrivaled master of Rome. For the rest of Octavian's life, the people who knew him would simply call him Princeps, or First Man, but history would call him by a different name, Emperor.
Yes. Oh, I love that ending. Alright, I gotta see if there's an after credit scene. He's been putting them in lately.
Emperor. Emperor.
Emperor. I feel you. Sometimes you get stuck on those particular words in your recording. This is true. Octavian, or we should be calling him Augustus now, is known as Princeps, which, is sort of a relatively humble title when you compare it to Imperator, Emperor, which is what we call him now. Octavian was smart with that kind of stuff. He was good with his propaganda. He was good with his PR. He knew how to shape his public image, but all of that is stuff we'll get into in the future. I am so excited for future Historia Civilis videos on the reign of Augustus. I've talked about this before. I think his videos are absolutely fantastic. This was another fantastic addition. But I really enjoy the political aspect of Roman history, and I think Historia Civilis does a great job with it. And with the reign of Augustus, I imagine we're going to be getting a lot of that. I don't know what his future schedule is for these videos. I don't know if we're going straight into it or if he's doing some other topics, whatever. But I would love to see Historia Civilis videos on the reign of Augustus. I think he'd do an amazing job, because he always does an amazing job. Anyway, this was a great video. I feel like I don't have much of a conclusion, because everything I wanted to talk about, we talked about during the video. The life and death of both Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the fall of Ptolemaic Egypt, and the ascension of Octavian. He's finally defeated all of his rivals. As Historia Civilis put it, he's the master of Rome, and he will remain the master of Rome. Some really great stuff. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you hit the notification button next to the subscribe button, you'll be notified whenever I release a new video. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.